It's the number to call to talk. You know it. 974-8255. Roger Kingkade, Rob Breakenridge. Morning Talk for Calgary on News Talk 770.
Hey, welcome back. I'm Roger. That's Rob. These mass beheadings, no, not the ISIS ones, the Saudi Arabian ones, they kind of go under the radar sometimes. However, occasionally they execute a political prisoner, if you will. They execute somebody with tremendous regional import in some respects, and they just did that with one Shiite cleric. And that has kind of led to a bit of a domino effect, and there might be a firestorm brewing now between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So correct me if I step off the path here, Rob, but just to identify the players and teams, the jerseys they're wearing. Saudi Arabia, Sunni Kingdom.
Correct.
Iran, yes. Shia Republic.
Right. Yes, exactly. Tensions between the two countries have been high for some time. This seems to have pushed things over the brink a bit here. I mean, it's not just Saudi Arabia now. You've got Bahrain, you've got the United Arab Emirates, who are all now joining Saudi Arabia in this diplomatic action against Iran, canceling flights, pulling their diplomats home, severing diplomatic ties. And certainly the execution of this Shia cleric over the weekend is at the heart of this and the very strong reaction in Iran to this. And I think the concern is when Saudi Arabia says it's prosecuting and executing terrorists, we should take the use of that word with a big grain of salt. What Saudi Arabia believes to be a terrorist, not necessarily how we might see it and view it and understand it. And certainly it's hard to see why this cleric, who was, to be sure, a thorn in the side of the Saudis, why he was lumped into this and why he has been executed.
All right, let's. We got a lot of ground to cover here because we're also going to try and read the tea leaves a little bit, if you will. David Weinberg joins us, Senior Fellow, Foundation for Defense and Democracies. David, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, David, can you start by telling us who this individual was that the Saudis executed?
Sure. Nimr al-Nimr was basically the country's most prominent opposition voice among its minority Shiite population. He was definitely a provocateur, someone who was very critical of the Saudi regime. But the Saudis never really made a convincing case that he was engaged in any sort of violence or terroristic act. For which they ultimately executed him. And he's basically come to symbolize for a lot of Shiite Muslims around the region a voice for equality of Shia in Sunni-dominated countries where they don't have equality. So his death really did touch a genuine nerve among a lot of Shia in the region.
Explain the precarious position that Shiites in Saudi Arabia are in. As you mentioned, they are a minority, but an often oppressed minority.
So Saudi Shia are particularly present in the kingdom's oil-rich eastern province, as well as in some of its southern areas along the border with Yemen that have been subject to particular instability recently with as a target of missile attacks from insurgents in Yemen. The Shia in Saudi Arabia have historically been second-class citizens. None of their members serve on the kingdom's top religious council, and they complain of pervasive discrimination, not just in employment, but in social interactions and treatment by the state as well.
Okay, so then was this particular cleric calling on Shia in Saudi Arabia to do anything, to have some sort of an insurrection, or was he merely a critic of the kingdom?
He was a firebrand, and he called for basically very outspoken, assertive protests against the regime, but largely expressed this with a desire for nonviolence, although some of these protests did in the end turn violent. He unfortunately falls into a category in Saudi Arabia which basically the kingdom has passed a number of regulations decreeing that acts of demonstrations, promotion of atheism, meeting with the foreign government, signing petitions, things like that, have all been criminalized as terrorism if they're seen to undermine national unity. So to what the Saudis and the regime perceived as terrorism, many of us in the West see it, Nimr's execution basically just as an act of authoritarian repression.
But what were Nimr's connections to Iran? Was he being supported by the Iranians? Were there formal ties with the Iranians?
The Saudi state did allege that he was receiving some support from Iran, although I haven't seen persuasive evidence of that yet. Mm-hmm. He, according to his family, one of the charges he was convicted on was encouraging foreign meddling in the kingdom, and according to purported leaked U.S. diplomatic cables, when the U.S. met with him a little over half a decade ago, he reserved the right of Saudi Shia to seek outside support to achieve their basic human rights. But it's not clear that he was a stooge of Iran so much as someone who saw Iran as potentially favorable to his cause.
Okay, so then what's the toehold then that Iran has in this particular conversation? Is this execution upsetting to the government, to the Supreme Council, or is it more upsetting just to Shia citizens in Iran?
Well, Saudi Arabia and Iran have long been at each other's throats. They're basically the two main Gulf powerhouses in this area, but they also are basically states that see themselves as standard bearers for Sunni and Shiite political Islam, respectively. And so the Iranians had basically been speaking out on behalf of Nimr because it fit not just their political and sort of convenient, opportunistic interests, but also their ideological identity as well. That having been said, the Iranians are probably responsible for the mobs that violated Saudi diplomatic facilities over the weekend, given that over the course of 12 hours, the Saudis made repeated requests for increased facilities protection against mobs that were gathering outside their facilities, and the Iranians really should have done more to prevent that.
What kind of a position now does this leave Washington in particular as they trumpet this new deal, this new approach to Iran? But obviously the Saudis as a key ally to be able to condemn this execution, to be a voice for minorities in Saudi Arabia, but also to still be able to stand up to the Iranians.
Sure. Well, the United States has long been in a difficult position with regard to Saudi Shiite issues because basically as American officials see it, the Saudis are an important partner, and their policies toward Shia in the eastern province are harmful for stability in the region, and most notably Saudi Arabia's most important oil-producing and exporting region. But that having been said, Saudi Arabia is America's ally. Iran is not. Iran is a long-standing enemy with whom the United States has a tenuous diplomatic agreement, and so the question is where will Washington see its equities in this fight, and what takes precedence, the interests of an ally or the interest of this nuclear agreement in which the administration has put a lot of effort.
In terms of any potential for conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran directly, I mean, they sort of are in conflict in different regions as they support different sides in Yemen, for example. But when we think about American involvement in Middle Eastern conflict, I think that, Kuwait comes to mind. And that's a time when America went into Kuwait to try and remove or to effectively remove Saddam Hussein. Saudi Arabia wouldn't need that kind of support from its ally, the United States.
Yeah, I mean, the Saudis rightly note that Iran has supported terrorism, not just in many parts of the Middle East, but also in the Gulf in particular. The Kuwaitis recently disrupted an alleged Iranian-backed espionage and terrorism cell. The Bahrainis have disrupted a number of them, and the Saudis have also been the victim of those at times, including in 1996 when hundreds of people were injured and about a dozen and a half were killed in a terrorist attack backed by Iran against U.S. military forces inside Saudi Arabia. So the Iranians could certainly turn up the heat through their terrorist proxies, and pro-Iranian terrorist groups in Iraq and Bahrain had already pledged terrorist attacks in the event that Nimr had been executed, which he now has been.
Well, in Saudi Arabia, I mean, it seems as though they're battling both sides because many of the executions over the weekend were individuals linked to al-Qaeda. The Islamic State and al-Qaeda, as you note, have both threatened retaliation against the Saudis for these executions. How does that play into it, and does this spill over into Iran, or rather into Iraq, rather, where you've got ISIS and you've got these Shia militias?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the United States has been pressing the Saudis to do more in the anti-ISIL fight, most notably since the Saudis virtually stopped almost all of their airstrikes against ISIS once the Saudis decided to pivot towards a war in Yemen instead. The U.S. administration has raised some concerns that this new Gulf spat could distract from the fight against ISIS. The Saudis have exposed themselves to potential retaliation, not just from Shiite terrorist groups, but also, as you rightly note, Sunni terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I think the Saudis probably bundled Nimr's execution with the execution of Sunni jihadists, including al-Qaeda operatives, in an effort to cloak Nimr's execution in a veil of acceptability and sort of further paint his image as a terrorist that the Saudis have been promoting. But I think the spat with Iran will likely distract a lot of Sunni Wahhabi hardliners in the Gulf and may provide enough of a distraction to shield the Saudis from retaliatory attacks. We'll see.
Okay. I mean, that's kind of the point of interest for me in all of this. You know, if I look at the conflict in Yemen as sort of a microcosm between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I sort of get the impression that the Saudis have, in a way, humiliated Iran by their actions in Yemen. Is that the case, or am I misreading it?
I think that's accurate. And in the same way that the Saudis have basically felt humiliated in Syria, where they see their Sunni co-religionists basically being what they call the victim of a genocide. The Iranians thought that they could hold Yemen as a new proxy state, and they've failed in that regard. And the Saudis thought that they could pull Syria out of the Iranian camp and have had their designs frustrated in part because they weren't able to entice a Western military intervention against the Assad regime. But in both regards, these states are very disappointed, and they do see their interests as directly opposed in many of these places.
Does this then lead the conversation to say that Saudis effectively put Iran on notice? Don't try anything. We're bigger and stronger than you?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be how this plays out from the Saudi perspective. I mean, basically, there have been some Saudi and pro-Saudi spokespeople who've made that sort of argument that this was to put Iran on notice. But ultimately, it's given a green light to Iranian hardliners that was completely unnecessary. They could have left Nimr in prison, or maybe they didn't need to convict him on some of these vague, catch-all, unpersuasive charges in the first place. There are more persuasive ways for the Saudis to have made this point, but I think you're right that from the Saudi perspective, that may have been what they thought they were trying to do. And
from the Iranian perspective, is this the catalyst that they've been waiting for?
Well, I think it's certainly the catalyst that Iran's supreme leader and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have been waiting for. They are in the midst of a very intense political and culture war within their country to determine the direction of Iranian foreign policy, and they've generally been predominant against the more moderate line in the country, and this is another opportunity for them to say, see, this fits our view of how the world works. Everyone's out to get us, and we need to stick up for our interests, even if that means doing things that basically are terrorism throughout the region.
Obviously, Saudi Arabia has its Arab allies. Who does Iran have as its allies?
So Iran is closely allied with a number of political actors and extremist militias or terrorist groups throughout the region. So in Iraq, it's particularly the former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who lashed out at these executions, saying it'll bring down the Saudi regime. In Lebanon, it's the terrorist group Hezbollah, who called this an assassination and indirectly blamed the U.S. Somehow. And in Syria, it's the bloodthirsty Assad regime that has perpetrated the killing of hundreds of thousands of its citizens.
All right. Well, we'll be there, David. More at defenddemocracy.org. Really appreciate the insight here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. David Weinberg is a senior fellow with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Canada has also condemned this execution, but I think Canada, like Washington, is in a tough spot here. But I think when the Saudis go too far, as they seem to have here, I think we need to call them out on it, right? I mean, the notion that, well, they're our allies, we'll just kind of look the other way, I don't think that's productive.
No, it's not. It's just such a confusing thing from the Canadian perspective, though, because we do have these contracts where we seem to be perfectly fine to industrially embolden their military and then at the same time condemn them as a nation. Strange. Let's take a break right now. We'll continue this conversation afterwards. You're listening to Kingkade and Breakenridge. This is News Talk 770. This is News Talk 770. This is News Talk 770. This is News Talk 770.